For over 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople stood as the last defense of the Roman Empire. They had survived countless invasions, storms and sieges, until one fateful morning in 1453, the world watched as a 21-year-old sultan, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, rode through the shattered gates of the city that every Muslim ruler had dreamed of taking since the days of the Prophet Muhammad. Historians call this the end of the Byzantine Empire, the fall of the Eternal City, and the moment when the Middle Ages finally gave way to the modern world. But what if I told you that the real story, the one that was buried for over 500 years, didn't end at the city walls? Beneath the headlines and the history books, there's a secret that has haunted both Ottoman and Byzantine records for centuries. It's a story so controversial, so politically explosive, that chroniclers wrote about it in code, survivors refused to speak of it, and later historians tried to erase it completely. This is the story of Princess Theodora, a young Byzantine noblewoman whose fate became a dark legend whispered in the shadows of both empires. What happened to her in the hours after the city fell wasn't just about conquest or the spoils of war. It was something that would haunt Sultan Mehmed for the rest of his life and change the way the Ottomans treated Christian nobility forever. Why was her story hidden? Why did both sides want to erase her name from history? And what really happened in the chaos after the walls fell? Once you hear the truth, you'll understand why it was kept secret for so long. But before we dive into the details, remember, every like, every comment, every subscription helps bring forgotten stories like Theodora's back to life. Her name was erased for centuries. Today, you can help make sure it's never forgotten again. But to understand Theodora's fate, we have to start with the fall of Constantinople itself and the desperate hours that followed, because what happened next would change everything. The siege of Constantinople was a nightmare that stretched on for 53 relentless days. Imagine the city's defenders, exhausted, starving, and outnumbered, watching as Mehmed's massive cannons, some so huge they needed 60 oxen just to move, hammered the ancient walls day and night. Each thunderous impact sent centuries-old stones tumbling, and with every crack, hope faded a little more. Food supplies dwindled, the number of defenders shrank, and the certainty grew. The city that had stood for over a millennium was about to fall. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine the Freeman knew the end was near. On the night of May 28th, he gathered his remaining nobles and commanders in the Hagia Sophia, the heart of Orthodox Christianity. For one last time, Orthodox and Catholic prayed side by side, their old rivalries forgotten in the face of disaster. Constantine removed his imperial regalia, choosing to die as a soldier, not as an emperor. When the walls finally broke before dawn, he threw himself into the chaos, fighting alongside common soldiers. He died in the melee, his body lost among the fallen. Some say he was decapitated, others that he died anonymously, stripped of anything that marked him as emperor. Either way, with his death, the Roman Empire, founded by Augustus and carried through the Byzantine age, came to a brutal end. But while Constantine chose to die with his city, others in the imperial family and Byzantine nobility scrambled to survive. This is where Princess Theodora's story truly begins. She wasn't Constantine's daughter. He had no children, but she was closely tied to the imperial family, possibly a niece or cousin. The records are deliberately vague, maybe to distance the family from what happened next. What's certain is that Theodora was young, likely between 14 and 17, and considered exceptionally beautiful, even by Byzantine standards. She was also unmarried, a rare thing for a princess of her age and status. Some sources hint she was being saved for a crucial political marriage, maybe even to a Western prince. Or perhaps she was destined for the church as a nun. Either way, her fate was about to be decided not by her family, but by the conquerors storming the city. As the walls fell and chaos erupted, the city descended into the brutal aftermath of siege, looting, violence, and terror. But Mehmed had given specific orders: find the imperial family, the high nobility, the scholars, and especially the young unmarried women. They were worth more alive than dead, and for Theodora this meant her nightmare was only just beginning. But what happened next would shock even the most hardened survivors. The search for survivors inside the burning palace was ruthless and methodical. Ottoman soldiers, acting on Mehmed's direct orders, swept through the sprawling complex, hunting for anyone of value. Theodora was found hidden deep within the palace. Some sources say it was a women's chamber. Others claim it was a sanctuary dedicated to the Virgin. That detail matters. If she was in a sanctuary, she might have been seeking religious asylum or even preparing to take vows as a nun. But no matter where she was found, one thing was clear: Theodora was unmistakably highborn. Her clothing, her bearing, and the luxury of her surroundings gave her away instantly. The soldiers who found her were janissaries, the Sultan's elite corps, Christian boys taken from their families, converted and raised to be fiercely loyal to the Ottoman state. Their relationship with Christian captives was complicated. Sometimes they showed mercy to those who reminded them of their own origins. Other times they were even more brutal, perhaps to prove their loyalty. With Theodora, they faced a choice: claim her as their own prize, or turn her over to their commanders for a reward. They chose the latter, a decision so unusual that several sources mention it. It suggests they recognized her as someone too important to risk keeping for themselves, dragged through the chaos of the conquered city. Theodora's world turned upside down. Imagine her terror just hours before. She was a sheltered noble, possibly destined for the church, now forced through streets filled with corpses, smoke, and the screams of the defeated. She would have known exactly what happened to women captured in sieges. But instead of being thrown in with the other captives, Theodora was brought directly to Mehmed's tent, set up outside the city walls. The Sultan hadn't yet entered Constantinople, waiting for the violence to subside before making his grand entrance. For Theodora, this was the moment her fate was sealed. She was a teenage girl, raised in luxury, now standing before the most powerful man in the world. What happened next would not only change her life forever, but would also haunt Mehmed and alter the course of Ottoman policy toward Christian nobility. The meeting between conqueror and captive was about to begin, and the consequences would echo for centuries. But the true nature of their encounter was something no official history dared to record. The first meeting between Sultan Mehmed and Princess Theodora is shrouded in secrecy and contradiction. No official transcript exists, and both Ottoman and Byzantine sources offer only fragments, each colored by their own agendas. But what is clear is that Mehmed broke with tradition the moment Theodora was brought before him. Instead of questioning her in front of his advisors and officials, he ordered everyone out of the tent except for his most trusted translator and a handful of bodyguards. This was highly unusual. High-value captives were almost always interrogated in public, both to witness their statements and to protect the Sultan from accusations of impropriety. Mehmed's demand for privacy was the first sign that this encounter would be anything but ordinary. The meeting lasted for hours, an extraordinary amount of time given the chaos outside. Mehmed was in the midst of consolidating his greatest victory, yet he devoted his attention to a single captive. What passed between them remains a mystery, but the aftermath was even more telling. When Theodora finally emerged, she was not sent to the slave pens or the holding areas for ransomed nobles. Instead, she was escorted to a separate, specially guarded tent, furnished with comforts fit for a woman of high status. She was treated as something between a hostage and a guest, a status that made no sense for a defeated enemy. Why did Mehmed do this? Ottoman chronicles, written to glorify the Sultan, claim he was moved by Theodora's beauty and dignity, deciding to treat her with honor as a gesture of goodwill toward his new Christian subjects. In these accounts, her story ends quietly. She is either returned to her family or allowed to retire to a convent. But Byzantine refugee accounts, written by those who fled to the west, paint a much darker picture. They claim Mehmed became obsessed with Theodora, offering her marriage, wealth, and protection if she would only consent to be his wife. She refused, holding firm to her faith and her identity, even as the conqueror of her city pleaded for her acceptance. But the story doesn't end there. Phoenician and Genoese sources, written by merchants who had no reason to flatter either side, suggest something even more complex. According to their reports, Mehmed's obsession was not just about desire or conquest, it was about legitimacy. He wanted Theodora's willing submission, believing that if the Princess of Constantinople chose him, it would cement his claim as the true heir to the Roman Empire. For weeks, Theodora was kept in a strange limbo. Not a prisoner, not free, not harmed, but never safe. Mehmed visited her often, sometimes daily, alternating between promises and threats, trying to break her resolve. This psychological battle would last for weeks, with Theodora's fate hanging in the balance. And as the days passed, the tension in Mehmed's court grew. His advisors worried about the scandal, the whispers, the risk to his authority. But Mehmed's obsession only deepened, setting the stage for a crisis that would shake the empire and leave Theodora's name shrouded in mystery for centuries to come. As weeks turned into months, Theodora's life became a strange gilded prison. She was kept in comfortable apartments, surrounded by servants, but every luxury was a reminder of her captivity. Mehmed's visits became more frequent and more intense. He alternated between charm and pressure, offering her unimaginable wealth and power if she would agree to become his wife, and then, in the next breath, reminding her of the consequences if she continued to refuse. For Theodora, every day was a test of willpower, a battle not just for her freedom, but for her very identity. The Sultan's obsession did not go unnoticed. Whispers spread through the palace. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, Mehmed's most trusted advisor, warned him that his fixation on a Christian captive was causing scandal and undermining his authority. Other officials pointed out that Mehmed had access to the most beautiful women in the world through his harem. Why risk political chaos for one defiant girl? But Mehmed was unmoved. The more Theodora resisted, the more determined he became to win her over. Not just as a symbol of conquest, but as a willing partner who would legitimize his rule over the former Byzantine world. For Theodora, the psychological pressure was relentless. She was isolated from everyone she knew, surrounded by strangers, and constantly reminded that her fate depended on the whims of a man who had destroyed her city. She clung to her faith and her sense of self, refusing to give in, even as the walls closed in around her. Theodora's resistance became a quiet act of rebellion, a refusal to let Mehmed rewrite her story. But the tension in the palace was reaching a breaking point. Mehmed's advisors grew increasingly anxious, fearing that his obsession would spark unrest among both his Muslim and Christian subjects. Theodora's continued defiance was a problem that could not be ignored forever. And then suddenly everything changed. Theodora disappeared from her apartments. Some sources say she was moved to the harem in Topkapi Palace. Others claim she was sent to a secret location outside the city. A few even suggest she was handed over to one of Mehmed's allies. The details are maddeningly vague. But one thing is certain: her status shifted overnight, and the court was thrown into turmoil. What happened next was so controversial, so damaging, that Ottoman chroniclers would spend centuries trying to erase it. Theodora's fate became a forbidden subject, whispered about in code, hidden in footnotes, and systematically removed from official histories. But the fragments that survive tell a story far darker and more complex than any legend, a story that would haunt Mehmed for the rest of his life and change the way the empire treated its conquered subjects forever. For centuries, the details of what happened to Theodora after her sudden disappearance were shrouded in silence and deliberate confusion. The official Ottoman histories simply stopped mentioning her, as if she had never existed. Byzantine refugee accounts grew vague, and Western sources offered only rumors and speculation. But in the 20th century, historians began to uncover fragments that hinted at a much darker truth, one that had been carefully hidden for generations. In 1923, a Turkish historian named Halil Inalcik discovered a damaged manuscript in the Ottoman archives. It was a private journal kept by a court physician during Mehmed's reign, never meant for public eyes. In one water-stained section, the physician described treating a young woman in late 1453 or early 1454, identified only as the Byzantine captive. The details were chilling. She suffered from deep melancholy, refused food, and bore bruises consistent with restraint. Most disturbingly, the physician noted she was being treated for injuries from forced attention, and that she was pregnant. This fragment, combined with other scattered evidence, allows us to piece together a likely scenario. After weeks or months of resisting Mehmed's psychological pressure, Theodora's situation became impossible. Whether Mehmed's patience finally broke, or his advisors forced his hand, or his obsession simply turned darker at some point, consent was no longer sought. It was taken. Theodora was assaulted. The sources don't agree on whether this was a single event or a pattern, but what followed is clear. She became pregnant, and this created a political crisis. If Theodora had agreed to marry Mehmed and converted, her pregnancy would have been celebrated as a symbol of the new imperial order. But as an unconverted Christian princess, her condition was a scandal that threatened everything Mehmed was trying to build. His entire strategy depended on being seen as a legitimate, even merciful ruler, not a brutal conqueror. Theodora's pregnancy was a secret that could destroy his carefully crafted image. So a decision was made. Theodora was removed from Constantinople, hidden away where her pregnancy could be, concealed and the outcome managed quietly. Some sources say she died in childbirth, others that the pregnancy was ended by force, and a few hint that the child was taken from her and erased from history. There are even whispers that Theodora herself managed to escape. But these are little more than shadows in the historical record. What is certain is that by 1455, Theodora had vanished completely. Her name was systematically erased from Ottoman, Byzantine, and Western sources alike. The silence was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of historical amnesia, designed to protect the reputations of both the conquerors and the conquered. But the fragments that survive tell us enough. Theodora's fate was a tragedy not just for her, but for everyone who believed that history would remember the truth. And what happened to her would haunt Mehmed's legacy, casting a shadow over his greatest victory for centuries to come. Theodora's erasure from history was no accident. It was a calculated act, carried out by every side with something to lose. For the Ottomans, her story threatened the image of Mehmed as an enlightened, self-controlled ruler. For the Byzantines, it was a painful reminder of defeat and humiliation, easier to forget than to confront. And for Western Europe, Theodora's fate was too complex, too human to fit the simple narratives of villain and victim that would fuel centuries of conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Over time, references to Theodora faded from chronicles, letters, and official records. Ottoman scribes omitted her name entirely. Byzantine refugee accounts that once mentioned her capture were quietly edited, later copies removing her from the story. Even Western sources that had whispered about the scandal in the 1450s were revised or corrected in later editions. The result was a silence so complete that for generations, it was as if Theodora had never existed at all. But history has a way of leaving traces, even when people try to erase them. In the 20th century, as historians pieced together forgotten manuscripts, encrypted letters, and damaged journals, Theodora's story began to re-emerge. What they found was not a simple tale of romance or brutality, but a deeply human tragedy, a young woman caught in the gears of empire, forced to make impossible choices, and ultimately silenced by the very people who should have remembered her. Theodora's fate is a stark reminder of how history is written, not just by the victors, but by those with the power to decide which stories are told and which are buried. Her suffering was covered up by everyone who had something to gain from her silence. Yet by uncovering her story, even in fragments, we honor her memory and the memory of countless others whose voices were lost to time. The fall of Constantinople changed the world. But for Theodora and thousands of women like her, it was not a moment of glory. It was the beginning of a nightmare that history chose not to document. They deserve to be remembered, not just as footnotes, but as real people whose lives and pain mattered. The greatest victory isn't making someone forget. It's making sure they are remembered forever.